Great experiences build great leaders. Great leaders build great teams. This is Building Great Sales Teams.
All right, guys, welcome back to the podcast. And you know today's show is going to be a winner because I've got Doug here on the podcast with Doug. You got two Dougs today. It's double the fun. All right, guys, we got Doug C. Brown. He's the founder and CEO of CEO Sales Strategies, the 1% Academy. And let me know if I'm pronouncing this right. Vibitino?
It's Vibitno.
Vibitno.
Yeah.
And he's also the host of his own podcast, CEO Sales Strategy Podcast, which is exactly what we talk about here on the podcast. Doug specializes in revenue growth and sales profit optimization. He's launched, worked in, or built over 35 companies, and he teaches others how to be in the 1% of sales earners in revenue and growth. Doug, welcome to the show, brother.
Well, thanks, Doug. I'm glad to have our name being repeated back and forth. So this is awesome.
So many times, right? Isn't your name like supposed to be your favorite thing to hear out loud? So we're gonna have plenty of that today. I think we're gonna get off the episode and just be on this high, right?
Absolutely.
All right, brother. You've wrote two best-selling books. Can you walk us through those books and what inspired you to write them?
Yeah, well, the first one I wrote was called Win-Win Selling, Unlocking the Power of Profitability by Resolving Objections. And I wrote that book really to help people because I kept going to events and people kept saying the number one thing I'm having challenges with is communicating with people when they throw an objection up. So I'm like, all right, I'll write a book about the philosophy, the psychology, where objections come from, how they, present themselves, and what frames are people using. And the book sat there for 2 years, and my now wife said to me, can I read the book? And I said, sure. She did. She started asking me questions, like question number 1, question number 2. And then she said to me, well, why'd you write the book? I said, to help people. And she said, well, how are they going to get helped unless you release the book? And what I realized is she was using the formulas and things I was teaching in the book.
She used it against you.
Yeah. So I released the book and, it did well. We didn't put a lot of marketing into it. It went international bestseller, I think, in 4 countries, and it's still out there today. And then I wrote a second book called The Nonstop 1% Earner. How do you be one? And then so we go through what is a 1% earner, how do they think, what do they do, what's different, because it's not, a lot of times people think the people who are making in the top 1 or 2% of income, they're doing things radically different than people who are in the, the 10% bracket, if you will.
Right.
And it's really not. It's small incremental nuances that get them there.
No, I love it. And I think, I would agree 100%. And typically what I've seen in my circles is it's the consistency of those nuances that got them there.
Absolutely.
Those things you don't think matter, like what time they wake up in the morning or following through with customers,
Right. And a lot of the fundamentals and the basics as you're talking about, and that consistency and the adjustment of the mind that needs to go through that process to be able to, receive and handle certain people and situations that they run into as they go higher and higher up the ladder. Somebody once said the higher the levels, the bigger the devils.
Yeah.
And, I was like, oh, that's kind of a corny statement, but it when we started going up in scale, sometimes that's true. So.
No, I've definitely been through that a few times. So worked in or built 35 different companies. How does one even have the opportunity to do that? Is that specific to your, was it a consulting position at the time, or, what exactly were you doing that gave you that opportunity to be involved in 35 different companies?
Well, insanity pretty much was the real answer.
Okay.
So, I was one of those kids who didn't know I knew what I wanted, but I didn't know how to call it that when I was growing up. Right. And my dad started all us family members working very early. I started at the age of 3 working.
Oh, wow.
And,
Okay.
I swept floors for 25 cents a week. Loved the job because I had a quarter, and back then you could buy a whole handful of candy for a penny. And so, I'd go, get pre-diabetes before. um, but and then around 5 or 6, we were actually thrust out in front of clients and customers. He owned an electric machinery repair company, and we would be writing orders, figuring out numbers, and my grandmother was helping. It was a family business.
That's
And
awesome.
yeah, it was great. And then I knew from that I wanted to have something of leverage, because what I remember looking at, Doug, was, all right, we'd pay $3 for a part, we'd sell it for $6. And I remember I was getting paid around 75 cents an hour at that point. And I was like, wait a minute, I just made $3 in 7 minutes or whatever this took. And my little brain at that time was starting to compute the form of leverage. So
Right.
that's kind of how it all started. So I was just trying side hustle businesses all the way through. And, I would go, I had like a paper delivery route that I had set up that all the other paper boys in the neighborhood didn't want to do their route. So I would get myself and my friends, and I would go and we would deliver their papers. I'd get paid. I'd pay them a percentage. I'd keep a percentage. I guess I was a sales manager back then. And so it was small businesses. And then at the age of 13, I got my first bank loan. My brother, I persuaded him to co-sign when my brother was 18. And, we started a music business then. And so it just kind of progressed through time. Not all the businesses were successful, like all people's businesses, but some
Right.
were, some broke even, and, a couple did really well. And I've worked in some that have, sold off eventually for $2 billion. So that one worked out okay too. So it's just
Wow.
kind of the way of the entrepreneur, I think.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about that business. Were you in there from the founding point, or did you just come in and execute some things for him and then get him ready
Yeah.
for sale?
No, I came in after. I was actually about the 100th person in the company.
Okay.
And then what happened was we started investing and reinvesting back into the company. And I just took on the sales side and just ran with that. And we grew from, I think it was 68 million. Yeah, no, 62 million to 360 million in 2 years.
Wow.
And that was a pretty fast growth. Yeah, I had a whole head of hair back then, and then I kind of lost it.
Yeah, I got some of that going on too. So just wear a hat, it fixes it,
That or cut it off, one or the other.
Right. Yeah, I definitely shaved it down recently just so I didn't have to deal with it anymore, trying to get it all perfect. But no, it is what it is, right? And we adapt. Okay, so what do you feel like in that business to add hundreds of millions of dollars to the bottom or to the top line revenue? What do you feel like was a pivot point for that business that maybe our listeners can learn from?
Yeah, on an individual level or on a business building level?
Both. I always love both in that case.
Okay. So in the business building level, there primarily was a direct sales force. So what we figured out is we could build an indirect sales force and an internal indirect sales, an internal agent force as well. So what we did was, for example, we went out and we built an agency for most part, right? So we would go and we find people who had independent relationships, and that became another sales channel. Then I will take credit for pioneering this one because I did. Then what I found was certain agents don't want to do all the work themselves, even though they were getting paid the majority of the commissions, right? So then I, took the internal team and I started doing an internal agency. So I would, instead of us paying, say, 25% out to the agency, we would pay 5% out. We would use the internal staff and have them go recruit their own agents.
Yeah.
And so what ended up happening, it was extremely successful. In fact, at one point I had 62 incoming calls a day for business coming into my desk just from internal agents. And so that's what started creating the growth, as well as us, investing and reinvesting back into the business. From a business perspective, that's what it was. The sales team, like a lot of companies, when you start, you don't have all the parts or all the pieces. So
Right.
we went back and did kind of what I do today. We go back and we just trained 4 days a week. We were like we were in the military, just get up in the morning and just train and train and train. And what happens is that you always have people at the top, and then you have people at the bottom. So, people who are just blowing out quota all consistently.
Right.
But that's usually your 10%.
The 80-20 rule.
Yeah, exactly. Right?
Yeah.
And so if you can take the bottom and bring them up 50%, it's a huge amount of revenue that comes into the company.
I love it.
And what happens is a huge amount of confidence that happens on the bottom end. So on a personal level, what's the statement? Like, people get out of high school or get out of college and they don't study again, right?
Right.
If we want to be at the top of our game, it's no different than brushing our teeth, so to speak. We get up, we don't think about it, but we have to continuously get better. And that's what we did. We kept raising the bar on the level of the skill sets and the level of delivery. So we would have conversational sales training, and we would talk about what worked and didn't work, and then we would get a process down, and then everybody could use that process. And we just that got force fed through that organization.
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine by that point you had some things that you implemented in that training, like specific to sales. And I know one of the things that you talk about is 5 must-have components to close a sale faster. Is that some of the training you did for this company?
Yeah. I mean, and you don't need all 5, right? But I mean, the reality is that, rapport, number one. A lot of people go, oh yeah, let's build rapport, and then we'll dive right into the sale, right? Right. And what we would teach is rapport needs to be maintained throughout the whole customer relationship.
Absolutely.
And a lot of people forget that. So, when they're selling, they'll immediately start, oh, okay, here's the discovery phase. So let's just jump in and try to solve the problem. But what they're doing is they're breaking rapport through the process, and they don't really realize it. So, rapport being like trust and respect, right?
Yeah.
So, and out of the 3, trust is the most important. And so we teach people how to maintain that through not only the sale, but then post-sale. And the higher you can build this level of trust, and I'm not talking about trust in ourselves, I'm talking about we must have the buyer trust us more than they trust their own decision. And if we can do that, then the buyer just trust us without question. And that's where we now go to additional expansion of the sale, whether it's internal expansion. We're driving, upsells, cross sells, or even down sells into, different product categories, or we're doing external expansion where we're picking up, 3 to 7 referrals per client. Right. And that's how we as a sales entity can grow quickly versus just linear selling. Like, oh, I sold this person, I'll move on to the next one.
Right. Yeah. It becomes less transactional at that point and more relationship selling.
Absolutely. And learning how to converse and finding out what are the people, what do they fear? What do they want? What do they value? What do they respect? Right. And understanding this information, like I don't see a lot of this in most sales, training in companies. They don't get into the person of the personality of the person or what makes that person. The buyer actually, what are they looking for? Because there's 2 types of ROI, right? There's a business ROI, which everybody tries to go for. Like, oh, hey, if we, I don't know, we're selling telecommunication services, we can lower your bill by 20%, right? And look what you can do with the extra money. But there's a personal ROI involved in that. And so if we're selling B2C, usually it's money is like the thing that they're most concerned about. But it can also be, hey, if I make this purchase, I go buy this new boat and I bring this back home, and my spouse catches me buying a new boat, dragging it in the backyard without permission, right? All heck's going to break loose in my relationship. So that's the personal ROI. And a B2B, that could be a career gone, right? I mean, we make a decision and we don't make the right decision, we could actually lose our whole job or our whole career. And, so the stakes get a little higher, and a lot of people forget these human dynamics. They just go for the business. And that's what we trained on a lot. throughout that process and still do today.
Well, and I think that happens. That's I wouldn't say acceptable, but that's what you expect at an entry level. You know what I'm saying? Of new people coming in, they're being trained on how to sell a product, feature benefit type training, but 100% you got to go past that. And in building that rapport, you find out those emotional motivators, which everything that you went through in terms of finding out from the customer was all emotionally motivated. Right.
Yeah.
And if you can sell that way and know, and then there's the ethical piece, genuinely helping that person get to those goals that they have that are emotional goals, which if it's B2B, it may be job security. You know what I'm saying? If it's B2C, it may be, hey, I want the boat, but I want to make sure my wife's okay with it too. And if you can help them kind of structure that conversation or bring the wife into the conversation,
even
then
better.
You're cooking with gas at that point.
I agree, Doug. I love that name.
That's a great name. Great name. All right, brother. So CEO at Sales Strategy, the 1% Academy, and Vibitno?
Yeah, Vibitno is it's actually coming out this year. So we've been working on it for a year. Vibitno is an automated, personalized, and I would say relevant prospecting and follow-up software.
Okay.
So the whole idea was, and this spawned out of that actual gig where I was having 62 incoming calls a day, because you can imagine if you get that many incoming calls, it's nearly, well, I'm going to say it was impossible to manage it all. Mm-hmm. So I was hiring assistants, like, please take these calls, right. Let me know. So, but my friend Mike and I were sitting at a Panera Bread way back then. Mm-hmm. And we were just, I won't use the word, but complaining loudly about all the things we wish we had. Like, how do we take a contact and stick it into play easily? And then if we forget to follow up with the contact, that a system would do it for us and remind us of these things and, kind of manage our day and all the complexity, right? Because back then, we just had DSL was just coming in. So it wasn't like the internet wasn't as prolific. Right. And so, we literally sometimes drive 2 hours to go to an appointment and, couldn't do what we're doing right now because it was so expensive to try to do it back then. I mean, you'd have to spend, $30,000 to set up video back then.
Camera setup and then high-speed internet. And,
right.
Yeah. And then good luck if the client had that,
Oh, yeah. Which they very rarely did. Right. And then we would set up like ISDN lines. It was crazy back then, but now it's so easy. But what happens when you drive to what I call a secret meeting, right? You drive an hour and a half and the client doesn't show up, but you do, so it's a secret meeting, right? So how do you handle all of that complexity that's going on while people are calling you and you need to get back and, cell coverage is spotty and all that other stuff. So what I did was, and back then we tried to develop it, but we couldn't because the technology wasn't even there. So today it's like, all right, how do you automatically prospect in an ethical, meaningful, personalized way? And how do we then take that relationship and continue it in perpetuity, even when we can't get to it, and make it personalized? Because I don't know, Doug, about you, but I know myself, sometimes it's taken me 2 years or so to close a pretty good sized sale. Right. And so how do we stay in touch with that person? We try to do our best, but if you have 300 contacts you're juggling at one time, it's hard with everything else that's going on. And then, lay in family matters and children and things that, people have in their lives. So I developed a system that would do this for people. And do this in a way that would connect, on the level that people want to be connected with, because, I'm sure you're getting these emails where people are just hammering you with emails now. Yep. And they're irrelevant. Yeah. I had somebody send me one 3 days ago that was like, in your manufacturing facility, I'm sure you're going through XYZ.
Yeah, exactly. In your agency. No, I don't have an agency.
Exactly. one guy thought I was in Pennsylvania and I live in
Right.
New Hampshire, right? So it's kind of like,
It's just bad data is what they're
right,
bringing
bad
up.
data,
Yeah.
and it's so how do we take, when I worked with a man named Chet Holmes for 7 years,
Oh yeah.
and
I read one of his books.
yeah, Chet was a great guy. He's passed on now, but he had a concept called the Dream 100, right, where you take your dreamy accounts, the top 100. So what if we could take a Dream 200 and we could close 15% of them a year? And how do you do that, right? So the software itself was also fashioned and with those type of thoughts that a salesperson, to get to the 1%, or some people don't want to be at the 1%, and that's fine too. Maybe it's the 10% to get to that level, but to do it with leverage, we all need help, and that's what the software is developed for.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's a lot that you said in there that I want to walk through, and the first part is just this idea of being in constant contact with your prospects, right?
Mhm.
And so we know it's evolved since you guys were complaining loudly at the Panera Bread. It has evolved, right?
Yeah,
So
totally.
there's softwares out there like Salesforce, Go High Level, CRMs, right? But I think what you're talking about is at a very basic level. The lead comes in and you don't close the lead, and then they get put on a 16 contact point drip campaign, right?
Yeah.
But everybody gets put on that same campaign. So I guess my question is, and this is to kind of like open this up for our listeners a little bit, is like, okay, I can go out, I can get Go High Level, or I can get a white label version of it from somebody that's in my niche, right? And they understand, let's just say it's solar. They understand solar, so they build it out for solar. I pay them a couple $100 a month, and I run all my leads through there, right? I'm guessing this is kind of the 2.0 version of that when it comes to personalization, and how are you guys doing that, I guess, without a lot of manual work?
Yeah. So it is the 2.0 version, or I'd say 3.0 in some capacity.
Okay.
It's so let's say you're speaking with somebody, and this happens a lot. People go to networking events. They pick up cards. They say, "Oh yeah, we'll get back in touch with one another." And I've measured this over a couple of years, so I can tell you concretely, it's about 13% of the people actually communicate with one another.
I love that stat.
Right.
It is. It's a convicting stat. We go to these things and we think, oh, I did so much work today. But
Yeah.
if we knew in our heads that 13% would actually end in another conversation,
Yeah.
then we'd feel like, wow, if I don't capitalize on this, then I didn't do anything. I didn't do much of anything today.
Right. and that's what happens, and it's still consistent. When I go to events and we collect cards, I still measure it. It comes in between 13 and 13.7%. That's
Okay.
kind of what the average is. And so let's say that I go to an event, I meet somebody named Doug Mitchell, and Doug has, 2 children. We'll say, I don't know, give me some names, Doug.
Oh, three kids, Cameron, Madeline, and Logan.
All right. So Cameron, Madeline, and Logan. And how, may I ask their ages?
9, 11, and 12. Madeline's the oldest at 12, and Cameron's in the middle at 11.
Okay.
And Logan's
11.
9.
Now I know why you're losing your hair.
More so now than ever.
and give me one child's interest, for example.
My middle son, he's in drama.
Drama.
And so he loves to act.
Acting. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So let's say we meet, and the system's smart enough to understand when I put the fields in the system, and it generates just a message to you, whether it's a text or an email or whatever we deem as the primary communication mode you like, right?
Okay.
And it comes out and it goes, "Hey, Doug, it's Doug. I appreciate meeting at the XYZ event. I was thinking about your oldest daughter, Madeline. I was thinking about your middle son, Cameron, and Logan, who I believe you said was age 9. And I was reading this magazine on acting, and Cameron's name came to my mind. I'd love to catch up with you next week. Do we have any option for that? I'm including my scheduling link for convenience. If you want to send me yours, please do. I'll use it. Right. And that's the message. Right.
Right.
But you didn't type any of it.
So what are you guys using is this like an AI tool?
No, it started out as actually because this was pre-AI when we started this concept.
Mm-hmm.
So I got this concept, quite frankly, from Harvey Mackay. Okay. So I don't know if Harvey Mackay wrote a book called Swim with the Sharks. That was his big one.
Okay.
So Harvey owned $100 million envelope company, something to do with envelopes. Mm-hmm. And I was selling back at the time, and I sold these really huge deals. And this company had this thank you, come to the Biltmore Hotel in Arizona, and we're going to wine and dine you for 3 days. And I was like, heck, I might as well go, right? So I go to this thing. Yeah. I didn't even know what it was. They were like, we were giving away a Mercedes. I'm like, all right, well, maybe I'll get a Mercedes. And so I go to this thing, and the two guest speakers, there's 150 people in the room. The two guest speakers are Mr. Tony Robbins.
Oh, wow.
And Mr. Harvey Mackay.
Wow.
Right? So I always wanted to meet Tony because he was an influence in my life. Yeah. And I was like, this is so cool. I actually ended up meeting him, a totally different story, at the event. But he did his shtick, Tony did, and then he went off stage and he had 2 or 3 big, men with him, and I'm like, there's no way I'm getting there, Tony. They'd break me into twigs. Right. So Tony goes off, and I'm like, darn, I missed my thing. And then Harvey comes on and he starts speaking, and I'm like, man, this guy's smart. So after he's done, I walked up to him and I said, Mr. Mackay, I found these points of your talk very inspirational. I had a couple of questions for you. Do you mind me if I ask a couple of questions? And he said, well, son, because he was much older than I was. Right. He goes, I'll tell you what, carry my bags to my limo and I'll tell you anything you want to know. And so I did. I would have carried him to the limo for this information. So I carried his bags and we got talking, and I asked him, I said, what is you've sold some pretty big stuff. He sold a $10 million account, for example, annual recurring. And I said, what's the secret? And he said to me, personalization and really getting to know your people. And I said, well, tell me more. And he said, and he explained to me, he said, look, I have this list. I call it the McKay 66. I have 66 separate fields that I gather information on people. It's all personal information and business information. And he said, you know what? I'll have my assistant send it to you. Wow. Here's her name, right? And so I walked him back. I shook his hand. I said, thank you. He said, I said, how'd you close the $10 million account? He goes like this. He said, I had a client that I have been trying to get into for 3 years. And I have been tracking all these data points that I was talking about. His son was an avid hockey fan for the NHL. They lived in Minnesota. So he said the son got into an accident, I think he told me, and ended up into the hospital. So I went to the Minnesota team. I think they're called the Wild today, or I think they were the North Stars back then. I went to the Minnesota team, and I had some contacts within there, and I got 3 of the NHL players to go see this kid. Oh my! And we took pictures with him in his hotel room, and then the kid told the father, and I sent the pictures to the father, and that's how I got a $10 million account.
Wow. That's awesome.
See, if we can connect, Doug, on a human level, I mean, if you think about it, we do crazy things for our significant others when we're trying to date them, right? I mean, we do everything. I mean, especially as guys, we do, we write poems, we write, we do all kinds of things that, other guys go, what are you doing? But the reality is, when we can show we care enough about somebody's challenge or problem or help them get with an opportunity, and we can connect as human beings, it goes a lot more down the line than, hey, I've got this XYZ thing that'll fix your issue. And you got 10 other people saying the same thing.
But the problem is we only have so much capacity to do that, right?
Correct.
And so that's why y'all developed this software of personalized follow-up. That's exciting. I'm very interested in that. I'm gonna check it out after the podcast for sure, and see how it all kind of works together.
Well, the MVP is supposed to roll out within the next 60 days if I
Oh,
can get
okay.
a couple of things. So I can give you
Okay.
access and you can start to check it out.
Yeah, and we've got all the links and everything. We're going to put them in the show notes as well. So if you're interested in that software, definitely check out those links, and then we'll continue to share that as it comes out, of course.
Thank you.
All right, brother. So one of the subjects that you like to talk about, and I'm very curious about this one because I feel like a lot of growth happens with tactical things and tools, right?
Right.
And honestly, especially early on in my show, that's what I talked about a lot. But what happens is the conversation always turns to, okay, the tools got me a 10%, 20% bump. Using these tactics got me another 20 to 30%. But what doubled and tripled my volume, my gross revenue, my business, or my sales, whatever the case was my mindset, right? And one of the things you'd like to talk about is how your inner voice can massively help or sabotage you in selling your products or services. Can you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, I can. This one I can guarantee. I'll explain it through something I used to do in my life, and then I think people will start to go, "Is this guy crazy or is he smart?" Right? One or the other. So for about 9 years, I would take my income up, and as soon as I got a little over $200,000 a year, I would back it down to about 90. I always under 100, right? Somewhere around there.
Yeah.
And I never really realized I was doing this, but I was just doing it. And then my first child was born. Her name is Rebecca. And Rebecca came along, and I was taking a walk at night, and I was like, I got to make more money. Now I have a child, right? I mean, it's like my brain was going in that mode. Like, I got to take care of her, right? So I'm like, well, I've already made over $200,000. Let me go try to make $300,000 or $400,000 at that point in my life.
Right.
And so I'm like, oh, but
because that's what children cost, $100,000 per kid.
Yeah, well, I guess it's 150 now to raise them, that per child on average. So back then it was easier because it was less and inflation wasn't as bad. But but it was still, still a fair amount. But I mean, as you and I both know, I mean, having a child, it just, your value system starts shifting and you think differently. It's just a very strange and wonderful thing, all at the same time. And so I was taking a walk, and it was like the sun was coming down, and I was like thinking, why? My God, I've been backing my income down, bring it up, backing down, bring it up. What happened? And all of a sudden I realized, I was like, oh my gosh. I have an older brother. His name is David. Super smart guy. He's 9 years older than I am. And I remember growing up that my parents used to talk about him as a no good yuppie, that was the derogatory term back there, right?
Yeah.
Because he was a white collar worker and I came from a blue collar background.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Right. And David's, making $250,000 a year or so at that point. And they just talked terrible. It was awful. And I remember feeling that pain when I was little. And so now I come up and I'm that white collar yuppie scum. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But I didn't think about it. So anytime my income went up, I'd back it down. Why? When my income went up, I started hearing those comments about myself, and I wanted my parents' approval and love. And so I'd back it down. Everything would be fine.
Yeah.
But then I faced the dilemma. My child's going to win or my parents are going to win. Well, guess who won? My child, right? So this is how our mind can stop us or help us moving forward. So I had to make a decision. Was it Rebecca or my parents? And Rebecca definitely won. And she would win every single time. But what I didn't know was why it was always happening. So I went on a real quest and a study to figure out how these things happen. Because then I started noticing other people. Like I would notice people having call reluctance, and picking up the phone. And I would talk to them and I'd say, well, what's going on? And they'd go, I feel terrible. I'm interrupting people. I'd be like, it's a cold call. Of course you're going to interrupt people. And they go, I just don't feel right. So I'd get talking to them and I'd find out they grew up in an environment where their parents taught them, if you interrupt people, you're the rudest piece of junk on the earth.
Right.
And now you're in a situation where you got to interrupt people in order to make a living, right?
Yeah.
So here's what I've discovered. We develop these protection mechanisms to serve a template of love that we are taught growing up. So mom, dad, preacher, teacher, brother, sister, peer group, whoever, right? And what we do is we even if we internally, when we're younger, we don't say no, we comply. But then we keep complying to that, and we're now reinforcing behavior, and it becomes habitual. And that's when we're in trouble, because once it becomes habitual, we stop thinking about it and we just keep doing it. Now, that same behavior might have served us in that relationship to get through that relationship, but now we go into a new environment like cold calling, and it no longer serves us. But we still, you know, as children, want to be accepted by their parents, right? So we carry these things along. And so what I did was I figured out, okay, how do we undo those things? Like, you know, in fact, I mean, Tony Robbins was the first foray into it for me. But it's really about creating awareness. And once you get the awareness, understanding what the trigger levels are, interrupting the trigger levels, reframing them with new behaviors and patterns, and then taking the pathway we want to go versus the automatic pathway that we weren't. I mean, that's kind of the synopsis of it. But that can stop people cold. And I'm sure you've seen it over your career where you're just like, why did they make this decision? But when you trace it back, it usually goes back to childhood wounds or childhood trauma, or even if they were taught a certain way. Like I had a friend, she was beautiful. I mean, she was a model. And she would never let anybody see her without makeup. And I was completely blown away, because I'm like, you don't need makeup. Like, like, trust me, you don't need makeup. I walk down the street with you, and there's 50 guys looking at you left and right, and whether you have makeup on or not. But she would never let anybody see her without makeup. And one time I saw her without makeup, she goes, "You're the only man in my life that has seen me without my makeup." And I said, "What about your husband?" She goes, "He hasn't seen me without my makeup."
Wow.
So if we have a scenario where a parent is saying to the child, "Listen, you know, you look amazing, but you should adjust your hair this way because you look better." And like little things, just little picking things, the child can also develop the same thing. Like, okay, I'm not good enough. I'm not accepted. And so it turns out to be something like that, right? So it carries on both sides. So yeah, our brains can actually take us stardom, or it can just slap us on the floor. And in selling, we have to not only learn the skill sets, but we must embrace that side of our life in order to release those skill sets to work. Because it's like having the greatest tool, but if you never turn it on because you're afraid the tool's gonna, I don't know, bite you or cut you or whatever, that's how it plays out. Is that answering part of the question, Doug?
No, I think it's answering all the question, and it's a massive point that I feel like if you're driving, if you're listening at home, if you're driving, pull over. If you're listening at home, you need to take the time to figure out what that cycle is for you that you keep running over and over again. For me personally, it was I needed a fight in order to be productive. I needed a fight, right? Because when I was younger, I had the mommy issues and the daddy issues, didn't want me around, moved in with my aunt. So I had the whole orphan syndrome, you know what I'm saying? That I wasn't good enough. So I had to go out. When I did go out I couldn't wait to get out of the house and prove I could make it on my own. I could be somebody, I could do something great with my life. And then I went out and did it, and I got bored. And then of course the company revenue went back down, my income went back down. And then it was like, oh, hey, I can't pay my bills. There's a fight. All right, I'm going to fight. You know what I mean? New product, something, create some kind of chaos. So I had something to defeat. You know what I mean? And I did that for about 10 years, from 18 to 28. And I realized, hey, I should probably stop doing this. This is like getting old. You know, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not growing. But you don't really become I mean, let's be honest, there's a lot more information out in the world today. So I feel like young people become self-aware a lot younger, to a detriment sometimes. Sometimes they just need to go out and do the work, you know?
Sure.
But I feel like it happens a lot younger. But, you know, for me, you know, I'm 37 now. We didn't have a lot of the information that's out there on TikTok and Instagram and, you know, YouTube. And so it was like I did that cycle for 10 good years. And then I became self-aware and was like, hey, I'm doing this to myself. This is not external, and then you finally leave that victim mentality and take extreme ownership.
Mhm.
It's like, okay, I've got to develop myself out of this, and on a micro scale, it happens all the time in sales. And then on a macro scale, it happens over the course of a career or a decade,
Right.
And so I think it's an amazing conversation for sure.
Yeah, and the crazy part is people think, well, I got a business problem, and it's not really a business problem. I've rarely seen business problems be business problems. They're usually, a personal problem. It's kind of like, I don't know, a guy who's an attorney, right? And he's great in the courtroom with arguing and getting and winning cases and everything else and interrogating witnesses. And then he comes home and he does it to his children and his wife.
Yeah.
Right. And all of a sudden he ends up in a really bad relationship, and he's like a really good guy. Yeah. But the thing is he where did he learn it? Back in childhood, like you said, you were in a situation, good's never good enough, so to speak. Yeah. So you're going to constantly try to prove that. Well, that fight will work great in certain situations, because I went through similar things, right? Like in the military, it served me perfectly well in the military. Yeah. Right? It was awesome. But then when you go into a boardroom where, you're sitting with billionaires and you're like, bam, right at them or whatever, they don't put up with it. They don't need to. Right. So it's one of those things that self-awareness, and I congratulate you on that, because that self-awareness is the first step, because a lot of times people just don't realize it's happening.
Well, and that's why the 1% is the 1%.
Right.
Because 95% of people don't even realize that. The other 4% do realize it. Maybe they're entrepreneurs, you know what I'm saying? And then the 1% is the entrepreneur or the high level key person at a $2 billion exit. You know what I'm saying? Right. So no, I love the conversation that we've had today, Doug. Again, great name, great guy. You know what I'm saying? And you've got a lot going on. What are you most excited about right now that you have coming out in the coming months?
Business-wise or personal?
Business-wise.
Oh, business-wise?
Yeah.
Most of my life, I use money as a metric, right? As a like, okay, if I'm here, I'm successful. And then as I get older, I realized I can't take it with me.
Right.
It's like I can't. It's a very weird thing. Like, the moment I'm 61 now, and when I turned 60,
I would have said 41. That's crazy.
Well, I have a great wife who keeps me in shape.
Nice.
So, and I also think, as we were talking about with the inner voice or the inner guidance system, that part keeps you young as well, right? And so what I've kind of shifted my life to is, how do I serve more people? How do I help people now? Far more, because I don't need the money. I mean, I always need the money. Everybody needs money, but it's not like I'm struggling or know that I will ever struggle. I will never starve. I know that, right? So that hierarchy of needs thing in Maslow or whatever, I'm at a certain level. And now what's most exciting for me is I can help other people earn whatever they want, really. I mean, some people are happy at $150,000 a year. Some people want 1.9 million a year, or some people want 50 million. But I have a pathway that I can teach that's replicatable, and that's what I'm most excited about. So with the academy itself and putting the technology and everything together, that's what it jazzes me up about the business side.
Yeah, I do love the companies that you have, because you've got a high level strategy company. You've got the academy, which is what I would assume is sales training and the execution piece, and then you've got the software to do the follow up and the personalized follow up. So it sounds like you got a 3-tiered attack there that's going to work for most companies.
Yeah, and individuals as well within companies. And I did a couple of beta runs on what we're doing, and it was off the chart. Some of the results, I was shocked, Doug. I mean, I had one guy who's doing 140,000 in commissions. He went to 2.1 million in commissions his first year.
Yeah, I was looking at your site. I saw the case study on that.
It's crazy.
That's awesome. But it's what we preach every day on this show, which is the systematic training and the results you get from that, especially when your subject actually applies it versus just doing about 10% of it, you know?
Yeah. I mean, the reality is if we go to the gym every day and work out, we're going to be much more fit than if we go once a week or twice a week or once every other week. You know, I don't even know why people go to the gym once every other week. I mean, it doesn't even make sense to me. But and if you have a guy like yourself who's been there, done it, mentoring, then all of a sudden we're getting compounding growth, just like we get compounding interest, right? And so if we do that over a period of time, you know, people ask me all the time, well, I don't know anything. How long would it take me to be a top 1% earner? I said, it depends on you, but my experience, it's been about 2 years. You know, are you willing to go through 2 years of the curve to, you know, earn a multi 6-figure or 7-figure net income? You know, if you are, you can learn it. And so, you know, but most people won't go to the gym for 2 years. You know what I mean? So that's part of the challenge, which goes back to the inner voice.
Absolutely. Absolutely, brother. Okay. Last question.
Yes, sir.
And this goes on typically happens on the personal side and bleeds over into the business. Sure. So, what does legacy mean to you, and what legacy do you want to leave behind? 2-part question.
Ooh, that's a big one. So, you know, I used to believe a lot more in legacy, and then William Shatner wrote a book, and he talked about legacy, and he said legacy doesn't exist, and it really made me think. I'm like, well, what do you mean legacy doesn't exist? We have Andrew Carnegie Hall, we have this, you know, all this stuff, right? So I'm not sure he's 100% right, but what he did say made a lot of sense to me. He said, the good deeds you do, those persist through generations. And so when I hear legacy, I think about, okay, what can I do today that'll affect 4 or 5 generations from now? Because, you know, 150 years from now, I doubt anybody, but maybe even my family or somebody who found me on, you know, Ancestry DNA would even know my name, right? So, but what will persist is the good deeds of what we've done. And so that to me is legacy. So how can you perpetuate something of greatness to go through lineage, you know, through time? And to me, that's legacy. And it's really important to me at this. It's always been important to me, but now it's even more important to me, because when you start to get 60-ish, you know, you start to see the horizon of life, and you start to come to grips with, okay, you know, maybe I got 40 years left, right? Hopefully. And so how do I want to live, you know, going forward in that period of time, not versus, you know, how many giants do I slay? You know,
right.
So my legacy is to teach people how to be self-sufficient and earn at least a multi 6-figure income through, you know, leverage of selling and understanding how to be a 1% earner, but how to think and act like a 1% earner. So then in turn, they can teach that leverage to their children, because quite frankly, kids coming up today, I mean, I think they have it pretty tough. You know what I mean? But if they knew how to leverage and sell like you do or I do, Doug, then they'll never, ever be without. Yes, the world's just always going to need them.
I couldn't agree more, Doug. Great name, by the way. Great name. I love it. I love it. I mean, it there's a legacy with your name on it, you know, and you're 100% right, unless, you know, somebody erects a building in your name,
right?
And even then, that building will crumble someday. In the scope of the universe, it's a blimp, right? And then there's the legacy of impact, you know, which is what you're talking about, which may not always have your name attached to it, but it will create those ripples.
Yeah, and we were in Hollywood area, and my daughters and I were walking. My wife, my daughters, and I were walking around. There's a Hollywood cemetery that has Marilyn Monroe in it, right? And weirdly enough, Hugh Hefner is buried right next to her, because he wanted to be, I guess. But we're walking around, and I'm saying to my daughters, I'm like, do you know who this actor is? And they're like, have no clue.
Yeah.
I don't know who Jimmy Stewart is. I don't know. And it really kind of hit me. It's like, well, that wasn't that are, who's Kirk Douglas? I don't know. That's Michael Douglas's father. Michael Douglas, didn't he play in one of those old movies, right? So
You're lucky if they know that.
Well, they're in their 20s now, so
okay.
But the thing is that reinforces what I thought Shatner said was, people are going to forget about who we are, but they won't forget about the good deeds that we do because they transcend through time. I don't know who invented the artificial heart.
Right.
You know what I mean? I don't know. I think it was a black surgeon, if I remember correctly, and I can't remember his name, right? But for the life of me, I'm so grateful to the man because there are friends that I know that have what he invented, right? And so his good deed passes down through time, but his legacy, I can't remember his name, and it's sad that I don't. I will look it up after our conversation here just to remind myself, but to pay honor to the man. But the reality is that there's a lot of stuff that we take for granted that we don't know who did it, but it persists through time, right? And maybe some of the big ones like electricity, we remember a couple of those people, or the telephone, we remember those people. But for the most part, we forget about all the other, who invented, ABS braking. I don't think if we polled the 10,000 people, maybe 2 would get it, possibly. Right. Maybe, who's the king of whatever country right now we could pick, who's the president of whatever country. We don't remember those things. And so that would be, what I think life really is about, is how to extend those good deeds through and live into who we truly are. And not worry about the rest of this stuff, because the reality is you're going to grow old and you got to face it one way or another. So you might as well just challenge it head on and get it over with. That's what I think.
Absolutely. I knew I liked you, Doug. I knew I liked you.
not just because of my name?
Not just because of your name. No, I appreciate you coming on the show, brother. You've given us a ton to think about. Like I said, write it down. What is that cycle that you're continuing, that your inner voice is allowing you to continue, that you need to break? And then personalized follow-up, I think, were two of the major things that you brought to the conversation. So thank you for that. And
you're welcome. Thank you.
If you guys want to get in contact with Doug, all the links and everything will be in the show notes, and I'm sure you can find him on LinkedIn and social media and all that good stuff as well. Doug C. Brown, guys.
Yep. That is me. If you type Doug Brown, you'll get a professional hockey player, and I can't skate to save my soul. So,
all right, brother. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Doug, for having me. I'm really grateful.
All right, let's get building.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Building Great Sales Teams podcast. We really do appreciate it. As you know, we believe that great leaders build great teams. How do you become a great leader? You learn from the greats. Join us at the $1 Million Mastermind put on by Ryan Stewman in Frisco, Texas, and learn everything that you need to learn to be that great leader. The link will be in the description below. As always, we ask that you like, share, and subscribe wherever you consume podcasts so you can stay up to date with the Building Great Sales Teams podcast. Let's get building.